This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. Everything around you, including your own body, is slowly shrinking and expanding. You can't see or feel it, but the space-time warping effects of gravitational waves are passing through our galaxy right now. Gravitational waves were first predicted by Albert Einstein in 1916, but their existence would not be confirmed until 2015 when LIGO first detected their ripples, the result of the collision of two far-off black holes. Thanks to the efforts of the U.S. National Science Foundation's NANOGrav Physics Frontier Center, a new milestone in gravitational wave detection can be revealed. Founded in 2007, the team has grown to include over 100 members at over 50 institutions across the globe. Today's announcement is a testament to scientific collaboration. We're joined today by NANOGrav Collaboration Chair Stephen Taylor, Assistant Professor of Physics and Astronomy at the College of Arts and Science at Vanderbilt University. Co-director Maura McLaughlin, Eberly Distinguished Professor of Physics and Astronomy at West Virginia University, and co-director Xavier Siemens, Professor in the Department of Physics at the College of Science at Oregon State University, to learn more about their breakthrough. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Nate, and thanks for having us on. It's really exciting to finally be here and to make this announcement. Essentially, over the last 15 years, we, the NANOGrav collaboration, have embarked on this really ambitious and in some cases audacious search for a background of gravitational waves washing through our galaxy and stretching space-time between the stars. And now finally, it's such a huge weight off our shoulders to say this, but patience is a virtue and we did it.
Can you tell me first, what are gravitational waves?
So gravitational waves are ripples in the fabric of space-time. What that means is, until 100 or so years ago, people thought that space and time were completely separate concepts, that space was immovable, time was absolute. But then Einstein came along and showed that it was pliable, it was dynamic, it could be warped. And what we call gravity is a byproduct of mass or energy warping space and time. It turns out, if you accelerate objects, really dense objects, in such a way that they orbit each other, they can then churn up the fabric of space-time and make ripples of gravitational influence that propagate outwards at the speed of light.
Can we break down exactly what space-time is and how gravitational waves impact it?
So space and time used to be separate concepts. They were unified by Einstein in this four-dimensional concept known as space-time. And they interact with each other. Gravity not only warps space and creates a dent in space, but it also warps the passage of time. And that also translates into gravitational waves. So in the same way that gravity is really a dent in space-time, and objects trying to move in straight lines will get deflected and turned into orbits, gravitational waves can stretch and squeeze distances between objects in the universe. And they do this in a very characteristic way. And that's essentially how we go about trying to measure gravitational waves. It's how they stretch and squeeze the space between objects.
Okay, so why is it difficult to detect gravitational waves?
It's difficult because gravity is a really weak force. So, for example, I can pick up this cup of coffee in my hand, and the entire planet Earth is acting on it to try to pull it down, and yet I can just raise it with my arm. And so gravitational waves are weak because gravity itself is weak. And the way we detect them is by measuring changes in the light travel time between objects that are affected by gravitational waves. And these changes are really tiny because gravity is weak. And so we need to perform really exquisite and precise measurements to try and find them.
Now, how do you distinguish gravitational waves from other sources of noise?
Right. So we spend a lot of our time dealing with exactly this. So what we do is we are very fortunate to have access to some of the most sensitive and largest radio telescopes in the world. We measure the changes in light travel time, and specifically what we do is we measure those changes in light travel time to different pulsars, which are special kinds of stars that are in our galaxy. Then, as gravitational waves are passing through the galaxy, they're stretching it and they're squeezing it, and that changes those light travel times. Now, it turns out that those changes are correlated. And what I mean by that is that how one pulsar moves is related to how another one is moving. And they're correlated in this very specific way between all the different pulsars that we keep track of. And that's the smoking gun. That's the signature that distinguishes gravitational waves. That correlation is the signature that distinguishes gravitational waves from other sources of noise.
You mentioned pulsars there, and I think we need to define what that is for someone who's watching or listening that doesn't quite understand. So can you tell us what a pulsar is?
A pulsar is a very exotic type of star. It is a neutron star. And if you look at stars like the sun, they are supporting themselves against gravitational collapse by slowly converting hydrogen into helium in their cores. And this process of nuclear fusion provides a pressure that pushes against gravity and keeps stars like the sun stable for millions or billions of years, right? At some point, all of the hydrogen is used up, right? And so there's no more conversion of hydrogen to helium. Stars that are about 10 times as massive as the sun will convert that hydrogen to helium, the helium to carbon to oxygen, and they'll build up and up and up and up until the core is iron. And once a star's core gets to that point, it can't produce any more energy and it collapses in on itself. And the outer layers will bounce off this very, very dense core. You've probably seen images of supernova remnants, right? And so they're formed in these supernova explosions. What we're interested in is the object at the center of this explosion. And that compact core squishes way, way, way down on itself until it's only about 10 miles across. You could fit one of these neutron stars like within a city, and yet they weigh more than the sun, like 1.5 times to 2 times as much as the sun. So they're extremely dense stars. My favorite analogy for the density is that if you took every single person on Earth and you put them all in a thimble, like a thimble that would go on your finger to sew, that is the density of a neutron star. All the people on Earth squished into a thimble. They also rotate very, very rapidly, because when you take something like the sun that's rotating like once a month and you make it way, way smaller, it spins up because of conservation of angular momentum. For similar reasons, they have very high magnetic fields, like trillions of times the magnetic field on Earth. And these properties produce radio emission. So they're not normal stars like the sun. We can't see them when we look into the night sky. But if we use a radio telescope, we can basically hear, we don't actually do this with our ears, but a better analogy is we can hear pulses. And the reason we have these pulses is that because of these high magnetic fields, there's a north and south magnetic pole, and the radio emission is beamed along these north and south magnetic poles. So every time this pulsar spins, this beam of radio emission spins past our line of sight. And so for every rotation of this star, we hear a bump, 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 a radio pulse. So they're not really pulsing, they're rotating, but we call them pulsars because we observe these very, very precise radio pulses, much like, the flashes of light you see from a rotating lighthouse.
So I think you guys sort of touched on that, using pulsars to detect gravitational waves, but how exactly do you do that?
So we do this through a process that we call pulsar timing. And what this involves is regularly observing one of these stars over periods of, say, years to decades. And each time we observe one of these pulsars with a large radio telescope, for instance, the Green Bank Telescope here in West Virginia, we measure with very high precision when the pulse at a particular epoch arrived. So we say, on this day, the pulse arrived at this time, and we measure that to sometimes like tens to hundreds of nanosecond precision. And then what we do is we build up something called a timing model. And this model accounts for all the astrophysical things we know that are happening to affect those pulse arrival times. So it'll have like the period of the pulsar in there, how fast the period's changing, how the pulsar is moving across the sky, if it's in a binary orbit. And so we build up this big model. And this model can predict with very high accuracy when a pulse, say, a month from now will arrive, or like a year from now will arrive. So we have these very accurate timing models. And once we have these models, then we can search for any small deviations in the arrival times of the pulses that are not predictable by our models, right? And so gravitational waves will cause very tiny deviations. They'll cause these pulses to arrive a little bit earlier or a little bit later than they would otherwise. These deviations are tiny. They are nanosecond scale. But because we've built up these models over like decades of time of observing these pulsars with these very large telescopes, and because pulsars are such extremely precise rotators, we actually can measure these very small deviations in arrival times due to gravitational waves.
I saw an anecdote from Dr. Taylor about finding the pattern in the data when you guys were shifting through. Can you recount that story for me?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing to mention is that these results and what we found didn't come out of a vacuum. There wasn't one single eureka moment because this is such a long experiment, and we've had hints and plenty of excitement along the way. Having said that, like many people in the spring of 2020, I was stuck in my apartment and working from home and trying to analyze very early versions of this newest data set that we were putting together. And along with my close colleague in this, Dr. Sarah Vigeland at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, we were exploring this very preliminary version of the data set. And then almost immediately, we started to see really exciting, compelling, high significance numbers for gravitational waves, and just a beautiful pattern, the kind of pattern of what Javi said as correlations between the pulsar timing data. And so that gave me butterflies. A lot of the analyses or kind of the constraints that we put can sometimes seem abstract. This really hit home. This really felt like it. And it is it.
What do the results teach us that we didn't know before?
There's a few things. I mean, the main thing that we get from this discovery is an estimate of how bright this gravitational wave background is and what the spectrum is. So how much power there is at different gravitational wave frequencies. It's consistent with being produced by very, very massive black holes at the cores of merging galaxies. We don't know that for sure yet, but that's the most likely source and is consistent with that. So one big thing we've learned is that if it is produced, by these very massive black holes at the cores of these galaxy mergers, it tells us that there's a lot of these mergers throughout the universe. So a lot of people have placed estimates on what the expected brightness of this background is. And ours is kind of at the higher end of these estimates. It's consistent, but it's at the higher end, which means that there are hundreds of thousands or even millions of these very massive black holes that are the products of these mergers throughout the universe. And that tells us a lot about how galaxies have grown and evolved over cosmic time and really just about the history of the universe itself.
Would you expect to see different brightnesses from different sources as it's detected and kind of coming from different directions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the amplitude depends on the masses of the objects and the orbital periods of the objects, and there'll be a whole range of these. And we expect within a few years, hopefully, we'll see, we'll start detecting individual sources. So we'll be able to discriminate individual supermassive black hole binaries above this hum of the background.
So what was the most interesting thing you've learned from this project?
Well, one interesting aspect that we encountered along the way, and this was actually a few years ago we first encountered this, was that the sensitivity of our analysis and the sensitivity of our observations was hitting up against the wall of how well we knew the positions of objects in the solar system. We have to take into account the position of the Earth relative to the center of mass of the solar system when building these very precise models for the pulsar behavior that Maura described. And in effect, we need to know the absolute position of the center of the solar system to within an accuracy of 100 meters. That's insane.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah, and it's not even a physical position. It's a mathematical location as the center of mass of all of these, the sun and all of the planets. The center of the sun is not the center of mass of the solar system. It skims the surface of the sun, actually. And we had to work that out. We had to improve the models, and we had to take into account the lack of certainty in this whenever we did our analyses. We think we've surmounted that now, and it's no longer a big issue. But that was, hearing it in terms like that, where you need to know it's within 100 meters, absolutely insane. And then, in general, the fact that we can do this experiment at all is interesting and exciting to me, as Javi described. What we're essentially doing is hacking the galaxy to make a giant gravitational wave antenna. That's absolute insanity, and yet somehow we've done it through hard work and perseverance.
Yeah, very crazy having that many points as and that far out as kind of magnifying things. It's very interesting. So, Dr. Siemens, you had a comment that I read about hearing the cosmic orchestra. I'm wondering if you can tell me about hearing the data and what does that mean to you?
Sure. So the signal that we think we're detecting is a sum of many gravitational waves, and if it's produced by supermassive black holes, then it's hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of binary supermassive black hole systems spread throughout the universe. And these binaries are orbiting around one another and emitting a single tone, like a single note, basically. And so the collection of all these supermassive black holes is like an orchestra or a choir. So that's where that analogy came from, that we're hearing all at once. And over the next few years, we hope to be able to pick out a few of the individual instruments, so individual supermassive black hole systems that are either very close to us or particularly close to us or particularly massive from our data, along with the rest of the choir or along with the rest of the orchestra that we're hearing.
What kind of difference does there need to be to pick that kind of thing out of the data or get new data sets?
Yeah, so in order to do that, what we'll need is to continue taking data probably we plan on continuing taking data for a few more decades. But what we think we will be able to pick out maybe a handful of these over the next 7 years or so, because these sources are a little bit louder than the background that we're seeing. Once we know that we've detected the background, we know that these sources should be around, should be nearby. So in the next few years, we hope to detect a few of these sources.
One big buzzword at NSF and in the astronomy community is multi-messenger astronomy. And I think one thing to add is that we'll be able to search in our data for supermassive black hole binary systems that have been identified electromagnetically. So right now, there are, radio galaxies that show evidence of two massive black holes at their core, and we can kind of like tune our detector to look specifically for those kinds of systems. So that's another thing that can really help us detect these individual sources over the next decade. There's lots of surveys out there that will identify these electromagnetic candidates for us, and we can go and look for them in our data.
So we're talking about collecting data over long periods of time. Is there any challenge in doing that?
Yeah. So over the time span of the current data set that we're making public and showing the results of, there have been a number of instrument changes, for example, and it's challenging to combine the data taken from different instruments. So that and these have been very important to our sensitivity, I should say. So we've upgraded some of the internals of the radio telescopes. There's also just really a lot of data. We have nearly 70 pulsars that we're monitoring, with hundreds of thousands of these measurements that we take for when the pulses from the pulsars arrive at our radio telescopes. So modeling those times of arrival of these pulses while simultaneously modeling all the noise processes that are in the data and the gravitational waves that are on top of that is a real computational challenge. But dealing with this challenge effectively is really important because we need to collect data for a long time, and especially for as many pulsars as possible for this experiment to really work.
Why is the announcement happening right now? Like what difference happened semi-recently that made this come together for you guys?
Yeah, so really the fingerprint of gravitational waves in this kind of experiment is something we've talked about before, and that's this unique, unmistakable pattern of correlations in the timing properties of different pulsars. And Einstein's theory of general relativity predicts this in a way that no other noise effects or systematics or astrophysical phenomena could masquerade as. And it wasn't until this data set and our analyses over the last few years that this has popped out. And now it's unmistakable. We can see this. We've analyzed. We've got this beautiful pattern that's in agreement with general relativity. And this is what gives us confidence now to say that what we had expected and what we had hoped before has come to pass. We have evidence for gravitational waves.
How did you go about finding partner? Like, what were your next steps?
Well, first of all, we had to convince ourselves that we weren't crazy. and we did lots of internal cross checks, so many tests. It took us a while to be internally confident, and that's a sequence of checks we always do. But then we really started to think about this as a great opportunity to reach out to our long-standing international partners across the world and work on this in an open and transparent and coordinated way. And so that kickstarted a process over the last few years.
Do you guys split up the data and have different people that are more specialized in different areas? Like, how do you process this amount of data?
So in that time, we've had to put in place a lot of organizational structures and framework. Those people are distributed across about 70 institutions. So we don't really have any sole nexus of activity. We're a very widely distributed collaboration throughout the United States, Canada, and even other countries. So NANOGrav has a number of working groups. So we have groups that deal with detection, that deal with timing, that deal with the noise budget, that deal with understanding the astrophysical implications. So there's a number of these working groups that deal with different aspects. We're also part of a broader international collaboration called the International Pulsar Timing Array, or the IPTA. This is like NANOGrav, but consists of NANOGrav and other PTA collaborations around the world. And we aim to combine our data from basically all the large radio telescopes in the world into one Uber data set. And this data set with more pulsars, more telescopes, more days of observation is much more sensitive than NANOGrav's data set alone. So one other huge logistical challenge is combining all of the data with our international partners. This is very challenging, just with different instrumentation on the telescopes, different ways of processing the data. But we're currently working on an IPTA data release and gravitational wave analysis. And that's really exciting because that data set should be more sensitive than the NANOGrav data set alone. And that should provide even more significant evidence for gravitational waves.
The last question I want to ask, and I want to ask this of each of you, or have each of you comment on it, is what are you excited for next? What is the next thing you are looking at digging in? What are you excited about?
Well, I'm really, really excited for that first single supermassive black hole binary that we find. And it really is only a matter of time until it resolves out of the confusion of all of its partners in the rest of the sky. Once that emerges from the noise and we can see that, we can go about the business of looking for what galaxy did it come from? What are its properties? Does it behave the way we expect? It's just extraordinarily exciting because really the prospects for multi-messenger astrophysics with these objects is just, it's insurmountable. It's an incredible opportunity. So I'm very excited for that.
Yeah, I'm excited about characterizing the signal that we've currently detected as well. So right now we have evidence for the signal. As we take more data and time more pulsars, we'll be able to measure the shape of the spectrum. And what we can do with that is then figure out the properties of the supermassive binary black hole population that produced them. We think it's most likely supermassive black holes that are producing them. So we can then talk about, how often do galaxies merge? How quickly do the black holes at the centers of galaxies find one another? How massive are they? When did those mergers happen? Basically, how did structure assemble over the course of cosmic time? And we can help answer that question. We have a piece in this puzzle that we can contribute to, and that's very exciting.
I think another thing that I find, very exciting is just in 10 years, how sensitive a gravitational wave detector can we build? We really don't know how many pulsars are out there that await discovery. That might be very precise timers that we can add to our array. And so that's kind of a very exciting mystery. Can we get up to 100? Can we get to 150? Can we get to 200 over the next decade?
Special thanks to Stephen Taylor, Maura McLaughlin, Xavier Siemens, and Jason Stoughton for the Discovery Files. I'm Nate Podker. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.